Hello, students. In this class, we are going to look at the conservative romantic reaction. Three events of the 18th century led to an unprecedented form of social transformation. What were these events? The Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and the French Revolution. Let us slowly, in order to understand why the reaction emerged, we need to go into these aspects of these events in a nutshell. So, we are just going to focus on some of the main aspects of all of these. Let us begin with the Enlightenment. It was a combination of rationalism with empiricism. It believed that immutable laws governed the universe and society, that society and its arrangements could be studied by deploying the methods used for the study of the natural world, that is, the natural sciences. Why should we do such a study? Because that study would enable humans to understand institutions and arrangements and how they functioned. They could then, through such a study, measure them in the light of reasons. The Enlightenment thinkers believed that all institutions and human relations should be governed in accordance with the discoverable universal laws. Enlightenment propagated that the church was not the custodian of knowledge, that knowledge was not derived from scriptures, revelations, or the sayings of saints. The only valid form of knowledge for the Enlightenment was one based on reason, empiricism, experimentation, that is quintessentially science. This was the basis of positivist thought in 18th century. The Enlightenment secularized knowledge. It created secular cross-cultural forms of communication and also created a secular intelligentsia and audience that was receptive to reason, ideas of secularism, and science. Thus, 18th century Enlightenment positivism could be seen as being essentially critical and revolutionary. Now let us look at the French Revolution and what were its main aspects. Absolutist monarchy, with its divine right to rule, was overthrown. The church lost its glory and supremacy. The church now became, under the Republic, merely an institution that was legally bound to work for the Republic. The church's property was confiscated. The family was radically transformed. Marriage, so long considered as the sacred union of two persons, were turned into contract. Divorce was legalized, that is, marriage was no longer indissoluble. Joint family property was done away with, and there were severe limitations imposed on paternal property. Education was centralized and broadened. It was taken over by the state from family and church. Education was turned into a political duty. What did the Industrial Revolution do? It brought about the very well-known factory system and new forms of labor discipline. It uprooted labor from family, village, and community. It led to the enslavement of the worker to the machine, or what we have called the dehumanization of labor. Anonymity and the self-centered character of the industrial city was often highlighted by its critics as one of the dangerous features of the Industrial Revolution. All these created what came to be known as alienation. Further, the Industrial Revolution led to, let us say, the transformation of landed property. All of these events taken together led to rapid social dissolution. naturally there was to be a backlash. And that came in the form of the conservative romantic reaction. It is often also called as the anti-enlightenment because the reaction took on its shoulders to respond to the Enlightenment and the two revolutions and explain why social dissolution happened the way it did. So it is this reaction, the conservative romantic reaction, which we will in short call the reaction, was significant for the birth of sociology. Sociology emerged in reaction to Enlightenment and the French Revolution. The reaction repudiated Enlightenment philosophy of natural law, natural rights, reason, and empiricism. The reaction believed that the institutional order given by tradition was absolute and unquestionable. Tradition, religion, and feeling were seen as natural as against the Enlightenment ideas of reason and science. For the reaction, faith and intuition were essential to understanding nature and society. French Revolution was seen as putting into practice the philosophy of the Enlightenment that the reaction sought to go against. Reaction judged Enlightenment philosophy deficient. Why? Because the Enlightenment failed to understand the positive role that traditional institutions have played in the creation of social bonds. Edmund Burke, Louis de Bonald, and Joseph de Maistre were the three central theorists of the reaction who had contributed to the birth of sociology. Let us now first focus on Edmund Burke. He was a conservative English thinker who came from the old conservative elite, having property in land. Burke argued that society should be viewed as an organic reality, as an organic totality with its parts. But these parts were not always perfectly coordinated and were not always in harmony with the whole. Therefore, reforms were necessary to ensure that all parts were perfectly coordinated and that all parts were in harmony with the whole. You will see that this organic conception of society, as advanced by Burke and as we shall see advanced by Maistre and Bonald, were critical in the formation of the sociological concept of society. So, coming back to Burke, he argued that reforms, not revolution, reforms were necessary in order to bring about coordination and harmony of all parts of that organic totality called society. So Edmund Burke was in favor of reforms in British India. We might have read and we might recollect reading him in our history textbooks in school. So he was in favor of reforms in British India and in Ireland, and he was a supporter of the American Revolution or the American War of Independence. However, he stood against the French Revolution, and therefore we might wonder what was in the American Revolution that went with Burke's position on history, on society, on institutions, and why did he take a position against the French Revolution? So let us look at Burke's reasons for his support to the American Revolution and for standing against the French Revolution. Burke argued that the American colonists were fighting to retain ancient rights and privileges, and thereby they were fighting to preserve the organic nature of society. He argued that the British King George III stood against the principles of organic society. because he attempted to deprive the colonists of these privileges that stemmed from the old organic society. Therefore, he blamed the king for trying to break organic society. Burke repudiated the abstract, rational conception of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. He was against the principles of general natural laws and natural rights. He pointed out that French Revolution treated society like a machine whose obsolete parts could simply be plucked out and replaced by the new ones. So you think that a particular part is not working properly or it has become obsolete. Well, you just take it out and replace it with something new. And he said that is not how society functions. He was against the concept of state based on contract. For Burke, the state was a higher organic unity and was integral to the national community. He believed that spiritual ties and sentiments, something that the Enlightenment was standing against, more or less, were binding factors in the national community. Further, going through Burke's ideas, Burke believed that individual had no abstract rights. All rights to each person accrued through membership by birth to the community. The privileges and rights were prevailing within the community, and by virtue of their birth in the community, the individual could access the rights and privileges that came with the birth in that community. So therefore, rights and privileges were organic and historical in nature, not abstract. A community, Burke further argued, is an endless chain of generations, and that the present generation was merely one link in that endless one. So it had a past, it had the present, and of course it had the future. What the French revolutionary generation did was to destroy the institutions and customs of the community, and Burke claimed that that particular generation, the present generation, had no right to destroy those because that revolutionary generation was not the sole owner of these institutions, these customs, these values. They belonged to the past and they belonged to the future generations of the national community. So, what right did one present generation have over all others to destroy these institutions? Nisbet points out that this reaction, that is conservative romantic philosophy, was an attack on the general history of European modernism, while the immediate point of departure was provided by the French Revolution. This was an attack on the very history of modernism. And it goes back to that first great event, the Protestant Reformation. It broke the church into two, the Protestant and the Roman Catholic. But it did far more than that. It uprooted, the reaction claimed, the individual faith from the discipline of the church. What was the result? The result was the perpetual disaffection and dissent. And we could see that this idea of dissent and disaffection had informed sociological writings. We could, for instance, refer to Durkheim's theory of suicide, where in his analysis of a type of suicide called egoistic, he looks at several things, several factors, one being Protestantism. And he argued that the Protestants, compared to Catholics, had a higher rate of suicide, although both the religions forbade suicide. What accounted for this higher rate of suicide among the Protestants? He pointed out that the Protestant was loosely bound to the church. Lack of rituals, and lack of that very structured Catholic priesthood were among the reasons he analyzed, the factors that he analyzed. Compared to that, the Anglican Church, which had retained some of the Catholic Church's rituals and a priesthood, would find that the Anglican community had a far lesser rate of suicide compared to the other Protestant orders. So we see that this idea of disaffection and dissent, of disharmony, had made its way into sociological classics. The Reformation's violation of church discipline, the reaction argued, logically led to the rationalism of the 17th and 18th centuries. The rise of the secular individual and the profanization of society for radical experiments, one definitely being the French Revolution, were to follow. Definitely, the French Revolution was preceded by this history. Let us now come to Bonald and Maistre and see their contribution to the philosophy of the reaction. Both these thinkers of the reaction had greatly influenced the development of Saint-Simon and Auguste Comte's sociology, which we shall see at the end. We are going to take that up a little bit before we wind up this lecture. Conservative thought defined society as an organic whole. We have already come across this through Burke, where traditional and irrational elements played an integral role in the ordering and functioning of the whole. Bonald and Maistre further advanced the idea that the organic whole called society was to be defined in terms of its inner spirit or soul. That essence was fundamentally religious in nature. That is, the soul or the inner spirit was religious in nature. Society was thus an expressive whole with its various parts manifesting its essence and spirit. This essence was irreducible. The spirit, the inner spirit of society, can only be apprehended through intuition and faith. Therefore, Bonald and Maistre claimed that society cannot be studied from outside through reason, empiricism, and experiments. It could only be, I repeat, apprehended through intuition and faith. And therefore, society was placed above all scientific scrutiny, and Enlightenment philosophy of progress was also thereby challenged. So Bonald and Maistre idealized the lost medieval order, and they claimed that medieval order was providentially arranged. They sought to bring back that order. They rejected the Enlightenment concept of natural rights of man and the rational principles of social contract theory. They emphasized on the values of hierarchy, duty, and collective good, as against the conception of rights given by the Enlightenment and put into practice by the French Revolution. Rights, the reaction argued in tandem with what Burke argued, that could only accrue by virtue of birth in a community and the community's relative place in that particular social order. So if a community did not have much rights, it was to be accepted because that was providentially arranged. Rights were not natural individual rights, but one pertaining to the social order. Humans, the reaction believed, acquired knowledge not by means of his individual reason, but rather by being a social being through tradition, by growing up in a cultural community. Now, Bonald and Maistre believed that tradition began with an original revelation and then transmitted and supported by the church and other fundamental institutions. Bonald and Maistre resisted the secularization of thought and society and claimed that providence worked through historical and social laws. Modernism, industrialism, and the French Revolution uprooted social beings from their community and turned them into isolated, selfish beings. So, Bonald claimed that the selfish I that modernism created was to be challenged and replaced by the collective we. So he endeavored to bring back that collective we as against the selfish I, and wanted to bring back to society the traditional institutions of family and church, corporations, and the rigid hierarchical structure of authority. We may recall that authority was the estate-based authority of pre-revolutionary France. The family, the church, and the state was to assure general social stability and social cohesion. We would find that in the writings of Auguste Comte, these find a particularly good analysis and good place in his sociology. For Bonald and Maistre, these institutions are based on fundamental laws. This medieval structure of society has been decreed by God, nature, and history as a unity. The laws and social relationships are based on the nature of man, a God-given nature. So that nature cannot be changed. Any kind of experimentation was to be disastrous. And they would point out to the reign of terror of the French Revolution as one demonstrable aspect of this kind of dangerous experimentation. Social laws expressed the will of God, the ultimate author of underlying social relationships. And therefore it goes against one of the Enlightenment thinkers, Vico's position that it is humans who make history. It is humans who are the authors of their own actions and their relationships. So, social relationships, everything. So, Bonald and Maistre made God the ultimate author of all social relationships. This rediscovery of the values, institutions, and virtues associated with medievalism could thus be credited to 19th century reaction. We may say again here that often medieval society or the Middle Ages were referred to as the Dark Ages, but that was given some positive value, immense positive value in the philosophy of the reaction. It impacted significantly on sociological thought. Some of the problems thrown up by social dissolution of the 18th century were those of order, solidarity, and progress. Bonald, Maistre, and Burke were of great importance for the birth of sociology as a science of society. Comte drew on the reaction's clear position that society was not merely an aggregate of individuals. It was rather a collective whole and an expression of a whole culture. We can see its decisive influence on sociological positivism of Auguste Comte. Comte took the aspects of reason and empiricism and progress from the Enlightenment. Here I may point out that Alan Swingewood is arguing that sociology emerged by taking and combining certain aspects of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and certain aspects of the conservative romantic reaction. So it may, as Nisbet and Zeitlin, Irving Zeitlin, in his book Ideology and the Development of Social Theory, was suggesting, both of them, that sociology was anti-enlightenment in nature. We may have some debates over that. That although the reaction and its values were very predominant, the ideas of science, reason, and progress also held considerable sway because Comte is arguing for a science of society. Although he is extremely influenced by the medieval virtues of the village and the family, but he still wants to see them in modern forms. From the reaction, Comte borrowed the irreducibility of the social whole, the harmony of its parts, and the role of traditional institutions in ordering society. Comte reordered the concept of progress through his doctrine of social statics, and here we find the influence of Bonnell's thought the most. So, their influence of Bonnell and Maistre becomes clearly visible. The science of society was to be positive, a positive science, not like the negative critical positivism of Enlightenment, but more taking from the reaction, based on the notion of duty, of limited rights, and this science of society should be capable of ameliorating the human condition. Questions of authority, of political obligations were equally important for the reordering of post-revolutionary industrial society. We find them reflected in Saint-Simon and Comte's sociology, particularly in Comte's positivism. Thank you.